Oh, finally. I thought they were letting just anyone in here now. The words, whispered just loud enough to be heard, dripped with the kind of venomous sweetness only true entitlement can produce. They were aimed at Dr. Imani Hayes, a woman whose credentials could buy and sell the speaker 10 times over. But in that moment, in the hushed, beige-toned luxury of a Global Air first-class cabin, her credentials didn't matter. Her degrees, her life-saving surgeries, her years of dedication, all of it was rendered invisible. The only thing the woman in seat 2A saw was a black woman who, in her mind, simply didn't belong. What she didn't know was that this quiet dismissal was about to ignite a firestorm that would scorch everyone involved, reaching the highest echelons of aviation authority. This isn't just a story about racism on a plane. It's a story about what happens when you underestimate the wrong person and karma decides to book a flight. The sterile, recycled air of LAX was a familiar purgatory for Dr. Imani Hayes. She navigated the bustling terminal with the practiced ease of a frequent flyer, her carry-on gliding silently behind her. It had been a grueling 48 hours at a pediatric cardiac conference, a whirlwind of presentations, panel discussions, and networking that left her both intellectually stimulated and physically drained. All she wanted was to sink into her first-class seat on the red-eye to New York sleep for 5 hours and wake up ready for a full day of consultations at her Manhattan practice. The ticket was a well-deserved indulgence. At 38, Imani was one of the country's leading pediatric cardiothoracic surgeons. She performed miracles with a scalpel, stitching together futures for children whose hearts were failing them. The pressure was immense, the hours brutal, and these brief moments of comfort while traveling were a necessary balm for her weary soul. As she stepped onto the jet bridge for Global Air Flight 214, she felt the familiar sense of relief. The chaos of the gate was behind her. The quiet sanctum of the first-class cabin awaited. She found her seat 2D, an aisle seat with ample legroom. She smiled politely at the man in 2C, who was already engrossed in a financial newspaper, and began the ritual of settling in. She slid her sleek leather carry-on under the seat in front of her, placed her small medical tote on the seat, and took out her noise-cancelling headphones. That's when she heard it. A voice from across the aisle, in seat 2A sharp and laced with disdain. Oh, finally. I thought they were letting just anyone in here now. Imani froze. The voice belonged to a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored cashmere travel set. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed her face, a mask of bored superiority. She was speaking to her husband in 2B, but her eyes flicked deliberately toward Imani. Imani had been on the receiving end of such comments her entire life. The subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that her presence in spaces of success or luxury was an anomaly, a mistake, a lowering of standards. Years of experience had taught her that engaging was a losing game. It would devolve into her being labeled angry or aggressive. So she did what she always did. She took a deep, steadying breath, ignored the comment, and continued arranging her space. The woman in 2A, who Imani would soon know as Carolyn Miller, was not accustomed to being ignored. As Imani placed her small tote bag into the overhead bin, Caroline spoke again, this time more directly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "Could you be careful? My Louis Vuitton is in there." Imani paused, her hand still on her tote. She looked inside the bin. There was a single, large, monogrammed suitcase taking up most of the space. Her small, soft-sided tote was nowhere near it. "I see it," Imani replied, her voice even and calm. "My bag is on the other side. There's no risk of it touching yours." She closed the bin gently. Caroline let out an exaggerated huff and turned back to her husband, whispering loudly. "The nerve of some people." No respect for others' property. Imani settled into her seat, slipping on her headphones and pulling up a playlist of calming classical music. She closed her eyes, trying to will away the tension coiling in her shoulders. She just wanted peace. She just wanted to get home. A few minutes later, a flight attendant approached. Her name tag read Brenda. She was the lead flight attendant, her demeanor brisk and slightly harried. She stopped at Caroline Miller's seat. "Mrs. Miller, so lovely to see you again," Brenda said with a practiced, warm smile. "Can I get you started with some champagne before we take off, Brenda?" "Thank you, that would be lovely," Caroline replied, her voice instantly transforming into one of graciousness. "I'm just a bit rattled." There was a bit of a commotion with the overhead bin. Brenda's eyes darted over to Imani, a flicker of judgment already present. "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Is everything all right?" "It is now," Caroline said, patting her chest dramatically. "It's just, one has to be so careful." Brenda nodded sympathetically, and then moved on her smile noticeably cooler as she reached Imani's seat. "Pre-departure beverage," she asked, her tone clipped. "Just water, please." "No ice," Imani said, removing one side of her headphones. Brenda nodded and moved on. The differential treatment was as stark as it was predictable. One passenger was a valued regular to be coddled, the other was a potential problem to be managed. The boarding process finished, and the plane pushed back from the gate. As they taxied toward the runway, Imani decided to make a quick call to her husband, Marcus, just to let him know they were taking off. She knew he worried when she was flying. "Hey, honey," she said, keeping her voice low, well below the volume of the man in 1C, who was loudly closing a business deal. "We're on the taxiway. Should be in the air soon. I'll text you when we land." "Okay, love. Safe flight." Marcus's warm voice came through the phone. "Tired beyond. Tired. You have no idea," she murmured. "I love you. Love you more. Try to sleep." She ended the call just as the engines began to roar for takeoff. The call had lasted less than 40 seconds, yet it was enough. As soon as the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign pinged off, Brenda, the flight attendant, was back, and she was not smiling. She stood over Imani's seat, hands on her hips. "Mom, I've received a complaint." Brenda began, her voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from speaking so loudly on your phone. This is first class. Other passengers are trying to rest." Imani blinked, completely taken aback. "I'm sorry," she said, sitting up straighter. "I was on the phone for less a minute before takeoff, and I was speaking very quietly." "Another passenger felt it was disruptive," Brenda said, nodding her head pointedly toward Caroline Miller, who was now observing the interaction with a look of vindicated satisfaction. The injustice of it was staggering. The accusation was baseless, a complete fabrication designed to harass her. The public nature of the reprimand was a deliberate act of humiliation. "I can assure you I was not being loud," Imani stated, her voice remaining level professional. It was the same tone she used to calm anxious parents before surgery. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Brenda snapped, her patience clearly gone. "Mrs. Miller is a Global Air Executive Platinum member. She knows our standards. We have a certain decorum in this cabin, and loud, disruptive behavior isn't tolerated." The implication hung heavy in the air. "You don't know the standards. You are the disruption. You don't belong." Imani felt a hot flash of anger, but she pushed it down. Getting angry would only prove their narrative. "I understand the standards," she said, her words precise and cutting. "I also understand that accusing a passenger of something they didn't do is poor service." I was not loud. The gentleman in seat 1C was practically shouting into his phone for 10 minutes, and I haven't seen you speak to him. Brenda's face tightened. I am dealing with the complaint that was made to me. Now this is your only warning. Another complaint, and we will have to take further action. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Imani sitting in a pool of stunned silence. The other passengers either stared intently at their screens or pretended to be asleep. The man in 2C beside her subtly shifted away, as if her proximity was now a contagion. Imani looked across the aisle at Caroline Miller, who gave her a small, triumphant smirk before turning to her window. In that moment, Imani knew this wasn't over. This woman and the flight attendant who enabled her were not going to let it go. And the feeling of dread in the pit of her stomach told her that sleep would be the last thing she would get on this flight. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a soft blue glow over the first-class sanctuary that now felt like a courtroom where Imani was the sole defendant. She leaned her head back, the plush leather of the seat offering no comfort. The humiliation burned. It wasn't just the false accusation. It was the complicity of the crew, the way Brenda had weaponized customer service to enforce a racial hierarchy. She tried to read a medical journal on her tablet, but the words blurred. Every rustle of a blanket, every whisper between passengers felt like a judgment. She was acutely aware of being watched. She ordered a ginger ale when the drink service came around, receiving it from a junior flight attendant, with a hesitant, almost fearful politeness. Brenda was nowhere to be seen, likely strategizing with her star passenger. An hour into the flight, Imani felt a pressing need to use the lavatory. She stood up, careful not to disturb the man next to her, and made her way to the front of the cabin. As she passed Caroline Miller's seat, the woman made a small theatrical gasp, pulling her arm in, as if Imani might strike her. Imani ignored it, locked the lavatory door behind her, and gripped the small sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was a mask of weary composure, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside. "Don't let them break you," she told herself. "You are Dr. Imani Hayes. You hold lives in your hands. You will not be broken by petty people in a metal tube." When she returned to her seat, she found Brenda waiting for her. Her arms crossed, her expression grim. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood another flight attendant, a tall, stern-looking man. "Ma'am," Brenda said, her voice low and menacing. "I have received another complaint, a serious one this time." Imani braced herself. "And what would that be?" "Mrs. Miller has informed me that you deliberately intimidated her as you passed her seat. She says you stared her down and made her feel unsafe." The absurdity was breathtaking. It was a masterclass in manufactured victimhood. "I did no such thing," Imani said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I walked to the lavatory, that's all. This is harassment." "What I have," Brenda countered, her voice rising slightly, "is a credible report from a long-time trusted passenger that your behavior is aggressive and creating a disturbance. Your attitude is making the crew and passengers uncomfortable." The word hung in the air. Attitude. The classic catch-all accusation used to dismiss black women who refused to be subservient, who dared to speak with confidence, who had the audacity to exist in spaces where they weren't expected. "My attitude," Imani repeated, a humorless laugh, almost escaping her lips. "My attitude has been nothing but calm. Your passenger has been harassing me since I boarded, and you have done nothing but enable her. Now I would like to sit down in the seat that I paid for, and be left alone for the remainder of this flight." She made a move to step past Brenda, but the male flight attendant shifted, blocking her path. "Ma'am, at this point, your presence on this aircraft is a security concern," Brenda said, the words sounding rehearsed. "You are creating a hostile environment. I have already consulted with the captain, and he agrees. For the safety and comfort of everyone on board, I am going to have to ask you to gather your belongings." Imani stared at her dumbfounded. The world seemed to slow down. You're kicking me off the flight. We're 35,000 feet in the air. We are returning to the gate at LAX, Brenda said, a grim satisfaction in her eyes. The captain has made the decision. The aircraft is being turned around due to a disruptive passenger. A collective gasp went through the cabin. Heads popped up over the tops of seats. The man in 2C stared at her with wide, shocked eyes. Across the aisle, Caroline Miller looked down at her lap, the picture of a reluctant, innocent victim who had been forced into this unpleasantness. "You're turning a whole plane around." Imani's voice was a whisper of disbelief. "Because of a lie. Please gather your things." "Now," Brenda commanded. "We will have security meet you at the gate." The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't happening. She thought of her patients waiting for her in New York. She thought of her husband Marcus expecting a text when she landed. She thought of the sheer, unadulterated racism driving this insane sequence of events. Numbly, she moved to her seat. She felt dozens of pairs of eyes on her as she slid her tote out from the overhead bin and retrieved her carry-on. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a profound, seismic rage that she struggled to contain. She kept her head high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As she walked toward the front of the plane, escorted by the male flight attendant, she made one last stop. She paused by Brenda. "You should know," Imani said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence of the cabin, "that you are making a catastrophic mistake." Brenda scoffed. The only mistake was letting things get this far. "Have a good night, ma'am." Imani walked off the plane and down the jet bridge, which had been reconnected to the terminal. At the end of the bridge stood Thomas, the gate agent, who had checked her in, looking bewildered. Behind him were 2 airport police officers, their presence a final, brutal confirmation of her status as a threat. She was escorted into the terminal, a spectacle for the tired and curious travelers at the now crowded gate area. They stared, wondering what this well-dressed black woman could have possibly done to warrant being personally removed from a flight that was now returning for her. The police officers were polite but firm. They asked for her ID and listened as the gate agent explained the situation based on the report he'd received from the flight crew: disruptive and intimidating behavior. They looked at Imani, at her calm posture and intelligent eyes, and a flicker of doubt crossed one of their faces. But their job wasn't to question the captain's authority. They informed her she was not being charged with anything, but she was banned from reboarding the flight. The airline would make other arrangements for her. Left alone in the echoing, half-empty terminal, as the gate area cleared, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, hard fury. They had not just inconvenienced her. They had branded her, humiliated her, and assaulted her dignity. They had turned a plane around to make a point. People like her were disposable. She sank onto a hard plastic chair, pulled out her phone, and scrolled to her husband's name. She took a deep breath, marshalling her thoughts, arranging the facts with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Then she pressed call. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight but controlled when he answered. "You're not going to believe what just happened. I need you. They kicked me off the flight." There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end of the line. Then Marcus's voice, usually so warm and gentle, came back with a chilling edge. "Where are you? Stay right there. I'm on my way. And Imani, I'm making a call." The silence in the terminal was a stark contrast to the hurricane of emotions inside Imani. She sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of Gate 48B, a solitary figure in a sea of empty chairs. The other passengers from her flight were being held in a separate waiting area, grumbling about the delay, their whispers and stares, painting her as the villain of their travel woes. She replayed the events in her mind, each microaggression, each calculated lie from Carolyn Miller, each dismissive sneer from Brenda. It was a textbook case of flying while black, a phenomenon she had read about but never experienced with such stunning severity. The airline hadn't just failed her, it had actively participated in her persecution. On the phone, Marcus had been a rock of controlled fury. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he had said, his voice a low growl. Imani recounted the story with clinical precision, from Caroline's first whispered insult to Brenda's final triumphant command to gather her things. She left out none of the details: the lie about the loud phone call, the feigned intimidation, the weaponization of attitude. As she spoke, she could hear the faint sounds of an office in the background, the quiet hum of computers, the occasional squawk of a radio. Marcus wasn't at home. He was at work. Captain Marcus Vance wasn't just a pilot. He was a senior Czech airman for Global Air based out of their LAX operations hub. He was one of the pilots who trained and certified other captains. He knew the airline's policies, procedures, and most importantly, its people inside and out. He knew the rule book because he helped write it. "They turned the plane around," Marcus said, his voice laced with disbelief and rage. For that, based on the uncorroborated word of one passenger against another. They sided with their Executive Platinum member. Imani said the title tasting like acid. Brenda said she consulted the captain. "Captain Richardson," Marcus muttered, and Imani could hear him typing furiously. "Frank Richardson. I know him. Graying hair, mustache, about to retire, flies the LAX JFK route 3 times a week." "I didn't see him clearly, but that sounds right. He's a go along to get along kind of captain, relies heavily on his lead flight attendant. He wouldn't have questioned Brenda's version of events for a second." Marcus sighed a sound of deep frustration. He took the path of least resistance, and in doing so he's violated about a half-dozen federal regulations and company policies on passenger rights and discrimination. There was another pause, more typing. "Okay, Imani, I'm at the ops center. It's a 5-minute golf cart ride from your terminal. I'm coming to you." "Marcus, what are you going to do?" "First, I'm going to make sure you're okay," he said, his voice softening for a moment. "Second, I'm bringing a friend." He didn't elaborate. He just said, "Don't talk to any airline representatives. Don't accept any vouchers or apologies. Just wait for me." "I love you. I love you too," she whispered and hung up. A sliver of hope cut through her anger. Marcus was not just her husband. He was her fiercest advocate. His knowledge of the system they were up against was an advantage she hadn't had on the plane. Meanwhile, back on Flight 214, the atmosphere was thick with resentment. The passengers had been told only that they were returning to the gate due to a security issue with a passenger. The delay would be at least an hour, likely more. Caroline Miller was holding court in her seat. "It's just dreadful," she said to her husband, loud enough for those around her to hear. "I've never felt so threatened on an airplane in my life. The woman had such an aggressive aura. Thank goodness that flight attendant Brenda, what a gem, was brave enough to do something." Her husband, a portly man named Richard, who had remained silent through the whole ordeal, patted her hand. "You did the right thing, dear. The airline can't be too careful these days." The man who had been sitting next to Imani, Mr. Henderson, in 2C, shifted uncomfortably. He was a quiet, unassuming accountant in his 50s. He knew what he had seen, or rather what he hadn't seen. He hadn't heard Imani's phone call. He had seen her walk to the lavatory without a hint of aggression. He had witnessed the entire exchange, and he knew the flight attendant's version of events was a gross distortion. But he was a man who avoided conflict at all costs. He buried his nose in his newspaper and said nothing. Brenda, the lead flight attendant, was in the galley, accepting praise from the other crew members. "You handled that perfectly," the stern-faced male flight attendant said. "She was trouble from the moment she stepped on board." "You have to trust your gut in this job," Brenda said, pouring herself a club soda, her hand still trembling slightly with adrenaline. "The captain backed me up 100%. He said it was a good call. Better safe than sorry." She felt a surge of pride. She had protected her premier passenger. She had maintained order. She had removed a problematic element. In her mind, she was a hero. The plane finally docked at the gate. The captain's voice came over the intercom, full of weary authority. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We apologize for the delay. We are dealing with a gate issue and coordinating with our ground staff. We should have you on your way as soon as possible. We appreciate your patience." The gate issue was a lie. The security issue had walked off the plane 20 minutes ago. The real reason for the continued delay was that the airline now had to file a mountain of paperwork to justify turning an aircraft with 150 souls on board back to the gate. Captain Richardson was in the cockpit, speaking gruffly with the station manager over the radio, trying to frame the incident in a way that would absolve him and his crew of any misjudgment. Down in the terminal, Imani saw them first. Two figures emerging from a service corridor, walking with purpose across the concourse toward Gate 48B. One was her husband, Captain Marcus Vance, unmistakable in his crisp, four-striped Global Air Pilot's uniform. His face was a thundercloud, and walking stride for stride with him was a man she didn't recognize, but whose presence radiated an even greater level of authority. He was an Asian American man in his late 40s, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his expression calm, analytical, and utterly serious. Thomas, the gate agent, saw them coming, and his jaw went slack. He recognized Captain Vance instantly. Senior pilots rarely came to the gate unless something was very, very wrong. He started fumbling with his keyboard, trying to look busy. Imani stood up as they approached. Marcus enveloped her in a hug, holding her tight. "Are you okay?" he murmured into her hair. "I am now," she said, pulling back to look at him. Marcus turned to his companion. "Imani, this is my friend David Chen." He then looked back at Imani. "David is the regional director for the Federal Aviation Administration." The name and title landed in the air with the force of a physical blow. The FAA. This was no longer just an airline customer service complaint. This had escalated into a federal matter. Imani's eyes widened as she shook David Chen's hand. He nodded at her, his expression one of deep concern. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "Marcus called me. I was at the Western Pacific Regional Office just a few miles from here. I'd like to hear what happened from your perspective." Marcus turned his gaze from Imani to the jet bridge, where the door to the aircraft stood open. His eyes were like chips of ice. "First," Marcus said to David, his voice low but carrying clearly to the terrified gate agent, "I think we need to have a word with Captain Richardson and his crew." The sight of Captain Marcus Vance in his full uniform, striding down the jet bridge with a man who radiated quiet, immense authority, sent a ripple of panic through the ground staff. Thomas, the gate agent, felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had seen Marcus Vance's picture in company newsletters. He knew who he was. A Czech airman held significant sway. To see him here now in this context was disastrous. "Captain Vance, sir," Thomas stammered, as Marcus and David Chen reached the aircraft door. "We, weren't expecting you." Marcus didn't even break his stride. "Open the cockpit door, Thomas. Tell Captain Richardson I need to see him on the jet bridge. Now." The command was not a request. Thomas fumbled for his radio, his voice cracking as he relayed the message. Inside the cockpit, Captain Frank Richardson was in the middle of complaining to the station manager about the delay paperwork when the call came through. Captain Marcus Vance is on the jet bridge. He wants to see you, immediately." Richardson's blood ran cold. Marcus Vance. He was a legend in the LAX pilot base, fair but brutally exacting. Richardson had been through a recurrent training check with him 2 years ago, and it had been the most stressful 2 days of his career. What in God's name was Vance doing here? And then the pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The disruptive passenger, her name, what was it? Hayes Vance. Vance's wife is a doctor. Oh no. Meanwhile, in the first-class galley, Brenda was sipping her club soda when she saw Thomas the gate agent lean into the cabin, his face ghost white. "Brenda," he whispered urgently, "you need to come out here." "I'm busy, Thomas," she snapped, annoyed at the interruption. "Brenda, it's Captain Vance, Marcus Vance. He's here, and he's not alone." Brenda's condescending smile froze on her face. She knew the name. Every flight attendant based in LAX knew the name. Captain Vance was married to a black woman. She'd heard other crew members talk about it. A surgeon, they said. Brenda had dismissed it as gossip. It couldn't possibly be her. She stepped out onto the jet bridge. Standing there was Captain Richardson, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Next to him was the imposing figure of Captain Vance. His arms crossed his expression, radiating a cold fury she had never seen on a pilot before. And beside him, the silent, observant man in the suit David Chen. "Brenda," Captain Vance said, his voice dangerously soft. "This is David Chen from the FAA. He and I were just hearing a very interesting story about Flight 214. A story about a passenger being removed from the flight. A passenger named Dr. Imani Hayes." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. "My wife." If the jet bridge had detached from the building and plummeted to the tarmac, Brenda could not have been more horrified. The blood drained from her face. Her carefully constructed reality, her narrative of heroism and maintaining order, shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't some random passenger she had power over. This was the wife of one of the most senior and respected pilots in the entire airline. I, she stammered, looking helplessly at Captain Richardson, but he refused to meet her gaze. He was too busy trying to save his own skin. "Marcus," Richardson began, his voice placating. "This is a terrible misunderstanding. My lead flight attendant brought a passenger security issue to my attention. I acted based on the information I was given to ensure the safety of the flight." "The information you were given?" Marcus cut him off, his voice like steel. "Did you at any point leave your cockpit to assess the situation yourself, Frank? Did you speak to the passenger in question? Did you attempt to corroborate the story with anyone else? Or did you just take the word of your flight attendant and a single biased passenger and decide to turn a multi-million-dollar aircraft around, inconveniencing 150 people and violating my wife's civil rights?" Every question was a hammer blow. Richardson paled. "I trusted my crew's judgment." "Your crew's judgment?" Marcus's gaze shifted to Brenda, and she felt herself physically shrink. "Your crew's judgment was to believe a series of escalating, malicious lies without a shred of evidence. Your crew's judgment was to humiliate a paying passenger based on nothing more than prejudice." David Chen, the FAA director, finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of law. Captain Richardson Federal Aviation regulations are quite clear on the conditions under which a passenger can be involuntarily deplaned. Attitude is not one of them. A captain's authority is absolute, but it is not arbitrary. It must be based on a reasonable and verifiable assessment of a security threat. From what I've heard so far, that standard doesn't appear to have been met. We will be launching a full investigation into this incident, including a review of your and your crew's conduct. The word investigation from an FAA director is the single most terrifying word a pilot can hear. It meant his license, his career, his pension, everything was now on the line. "Now," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "we are all going back into that cabin. You," he pointed at Brenda, "are going to stand there while my wife recounts exactly what happened. And you," he pointed at Richardson, "are going to listen. Then we are going to hear from the other passengers. We are going to get the truth. On the record." He turned and walked back toward the gate, leaving the captain and flight attendant standing on the jet bridge, their careers and lives unraveling in real time. Marcus approached Imani, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Ready?" he asked gently. Imani nodded, a new fire in her eyes. The shame and humiliation were gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a witness. Marcus took her hand, and together with the FAA director walking beside them, they walked back onto Global Air Flight 214. The moment they stepped into the first-class cabin, a hush fell. Every passenger's head snapped toward the door. They saw Dr. Imani Hayes, the woman they had watched being escorted off in disgrace, now returning, and with her, a uniformed senior captain and a man in a suit who looked like he could shut down the entire airline with a single phone call. The power dynamic in the cabin had not just shifted. It had been utterly and irrevocably reversed. Across the aisle, Caroline Miller watched them enter, her smug expression faltering for the first time, replaced by a flicker of confusion and dawning horror. Her carefully constructed drama was about to have a new and entirely unwelcome final act. The air in the first-class cabin was thick enough to be carved. The low hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed to amplify the crushing silence. Captain Marcus Vance stood at the front of the cabin, a figure of pure, undiluted authority. Dr. Imani Hayes stood beside him, her composure a stark contrast to the barely concealed panic on the faces of Brenda and Captain Richardson, who had followed them back onto the plane like condemned prisoners. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice resonating through the cabin. It was the voice of a captain, calm and in command, but with an undercurrent of cold fury that was impossible to miss. "My name is Captain Marcus Vance. I am a senior Czech airman with this airline. We apologize for the extended delay. It appears to have been caused by a gross and unacceptable failure in judgment by the crew of this flight." He paused, letting his eyes sweep over the passengers, lingering for a moment on Caroline Miller, whose face had gone from smug to ashen. "A passenger was removed from this flight," Marcus continued. "She was accused of being disruptive, aggressive, and a threat to security. That passenger was my wife, Dr. Imani Hayes." A series of sharp intakes of breath rippled through the cabin. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place for everyone. The man in 2C, Mr. Henderson, sank lower in his seat, his face burning with the shame of his own silence. The decision to turn this aircraft around was based on a series of complaints made by the passenger in seat 2A, Mrs. Caroline Miller. Marcus's voice was flat, clinical. He turned his gaze to Imani. "Dr. Hayes, would you please, for the benefit of Captain Richardson and FAA Director Chen, here recount the events as they occurred from the moment you boarded?" Imani stepped forward slightly. All eyes were on her. She spoke with the same clarity and precision she used when explaining a complex surgical procedure. She detailed Carolyn's initial racist comment. She described the manufactured incident with the overhead bin. She recounted her brief, quiet phone call. She explained Brenda's biased and public reprimand, the false accusation of intimidation, and the final humiliating ejection based on her attitude. She named Times quoted words and presented the facts without emotion, which made her testimony all the more devastatingly powerful. When she finished, a profound silence held the cabin. Her story was clear, coherent, and utterly believable. Marcus then turned his attention to Brenda. Brenda. He said the use of her first name, both intimate and dismissive. Is that an accurate account of the events that led you to contact your captain? Brenda was trembling, her professional facade completely gone. I was acting on a passenger's complaint. Did you witness any of this alleged aggressive behavior yourself? David Chen. The FAA director interjected, his tone deceptively mild. Well, no, not directly, but Mrs. Miller was very distressed. So you took the word of one passenger, a passenger you clearly have a prior relationship with over another, without any first-hand observation, Chen pressed. And on that basis, you recommended a course of action that has grounded an entire aircraft and requires federal reporting. Brenda had no answer. She just stood there, crumbling under the weight of her actions. Marcus then looked out at the other passengers. I know this is an imposition, he said, but truth is important here. Did anyone else in this cabin witness Dr. Hayes behaving in a loud, aggressive, or intimidating manner? He scanned the faces. Most stared down, avoiding his eyes. But then a hand went up. It was Mr. Henderson, the accountant, in seat 2C, next to where Imani had been sitting. His face was flushed, but his expression was determined. Sir, he said, his voice shaking slightly. My name is Arthur Henderson. I was sitting right next to Dr. Hayes. All eyes, including Caroline Miller's horrified ones, turned to him. Everything she said is true. Her phone call was a whisper. I barely heard it. The gentleman in front of me was far louder. When she went to the restroom, she just walked. She didn't stare at anyone or intimidate anyone. She was calm and polite the entire time. The flight attendant, he nodded at Brenda, was completely out of line. I should have said something sooner. I apologize. His statement was a cannonball blasting away the last vestiges of Brenda's and Caroline's story. It was the independent corroboration that sealed their fate. Caroline Miller could not stay silent any longer. She rose from her seat, a portrait of indignant desperation. This is an outrage, she declared, her voice shrill. I am the victim here. I felt unsafe. This man is her husband. Of course he's going to defend her. They're all ganging up on me. Marcus turned his head slowly to face her. Mum, he said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. You made a series of false allegations against another passenger, seemingly motivated by prejudice. Your actions have resulted in the grounding of this flight, a significant financial loss for this airline, and have triggered an FAA investigation. That goes far beyond being a victim. That sounds a lot like interference with a flight crew, which I might add is a federal offense. He let that sink in. Then he turned to Captain Richardson, who looked like he was about to be physically ill. Frank, Marcus said, you have two choices. You can continue to stand behind a decision based on lies and prejudice and face the full consequences from both this airline and the FAA. Or you can acknowledge the catastrophic error in judgment that occurred under your command and begin to rectify it. Right now. Captain Richardson was a man watching his 30-year career, his pension, and his reputation evaporate before his eyes. The choice was brutally simple. Survival. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and looked at Brenda. "Brenda," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "Pack your bags. You are being removed from duty, effective immediately. A ground crew member will escort you off the plane." Brenda stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Captain, you can't." "I can and I am," he stated, asserting the authority he had so disastrously failed to use earlier. He then turned to Caroline Miller. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "Given your disruptive behavior, including making false reports to the crew which have endangered the safe and orderly operation of this flight, I am under my authority, as pilot in command, ordering you to deplane. Your ticket will be cancelled, and your status with this airline will be under immediate review." The reversal was absolute, the karma poetic and brutal. "You can't do this to me!" Caroline shrieked. "I am executive platinum. I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars with this airline. I will sue all of you." "That is your right, ma'am," David Chen said, coolly from the side. "And it is the airline's right to refuse service to a passenger who compromises the safety and security of a flight. I would advise you to comply with the captain's orders." The sight of the FAA director backing the decision drained the last of the fight out of her. Defeated, humiliated, and exposed, Caroline Miller began to gather her expensive belongings, her hands shaking with rage. The same walk of shame that Imani had been forced to endure was now hers to take. The stares of the other passengers were not sympathetic. They were filled with contempt. As she was escorted off the plane by a stoic airline manager who had been summoned to the scene, Marcus Vance took the intercom. "Folks, this is Captain Vance again. Dr. Hayes will of course be resuming her rightful seat. We have a replacement crew being summoned to operate this flight to New York. We deeply and sincerely apologize for this unacceptable situation and for your delay. We promise you Global Air is better than what you witnessed tonight, and we will do everything in our power to prove it." He looked at Imani, who was now being quietly reseated by a new, profoundly apologetic flight attendant. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. The battle was over. The reckoning had been swift and total, but the war for accountability was just beginning. The flight to New York eventually took off, nearly 3 hours delayed, with a new lead flight attendant and 2 empty seats in the first-class cabin. The atmosphere was somber, respectful. Flight attendants addressed Dr. Hayes with a deference that bordered on reverence. Mr. Henderson, the accountant, offered her another quiet, heartfelt apology, which she accepted with grace. For Imani, the victory was bittersweet. The injustice had been rectified, but the wound it left was a stark reminder of how fragile her dignity was in the eyes of some. She spent the flight in a state of exhausted reflection, leaning her head on Marcus's shoulder as he sat in the now empty seat beside her. He had arranged to deadhead on the flight, refusing to let her fly alone after the ordeal. But the events on Flight 214 did not end when the plane landed at JFK. They sent shockwaves through the corporate and regulatory structures of the aviation world. Brenda, the flight attendant, was met at the gate in LAX by airline HR and corporate security. Her employee badge was confiscated, and she was placed on immediate unpaid leave. The internal investigation was swift and brutal. With testimony from Mr. Henderson, the damning report from Captain Vance, and the looming threat of the FAA, her fate was sealed. They reviewed her record and found a pattern of minor complaints, often involving clashes with minority passengers that had previously been dismissed as personality conflicts. She was fired within a week for gross misconduct, violation of company policy, and discriminatory behavior. Her union appeals were summarily rejected. She lost her career, her travel benefits, and her reputation. Captain Frank Richardson faced a different kind of hell. The FAA, led by a highly motivated David Chen, launched a full formal investigation into his command decisions. While he had ultimately made the right call in removing Brenda and Caroline Miller, he had only done so when his own career was on the line. The initial decision to turn the plane around based on flimsy, unverified information was a severe lapse in judgment. He wasn't fired, which would have been a legal battle the airline wanted to avoid, but he was removed from his position as a line captain. He was forced into a 3-month-long retraining and sensitivity program, a deep humiliation for a 30-year veteran pilot. He was ultimately reassigned to a desk job reviewing flight plans in the operations center, a gilded cage from which he would quietly retire a year later, his legacy forever tarnished. Caroline Miller's karma was perhaps the most public. Global Air not only cancelled her ticket, but permanently revoked her coveted executive platinum status and banned her from the airline for life. Her husband, Richard, a partner at a major investment firm, received a call from the airline's CEO, who also happened to sit on the board of one of his firm's biggest clients. The message was clear: his wife's behavior was a major embarrassment. The story, though officially kept under wraps by the airline, leaked. An anonymous but detailed account appeared on a popular aviation blog, and from there it spread like wildfire through social media and the elite circles in which the Millers traveled. She became a pariah, the first-class Karen, who got a federal agency sicked on her. Invitations to charity galas dried up. Friends stopped returning her calls. Her attempt at a lawsuit was quietly dropped after her own lawyers advised her that her case was non-existent and discovery would only lead to further public humiliation. Global Air itself went into full damage control mode. The CEO issued a personal written apology to Dr. Hayes and Captain Vance. They offered a substantial settlement, which Imani and Marcus accepted on one condition: the full amount was to be donated to an organization. They chose the Sisters of the Skies, a non-profit dedicated to supporting and mentoring black female pilots. Furthermore, Marcus, in collaboration with David Chen at the FAA, was tasked with spearheading a mandatory airline-wide overhaul of the training curriculum for all 20,000 of their flight attendants and pilots. The new modules, titled Implicit Bias in Command and Customer Service, used the anonymized case of Flight 214 as a core lesson in what not to do. It became the new industry standard. For Imani and Marcus, the aftermath was a period of intense activity and reflection. They were inundated with media requests, all of which they declined, wanting to handle the matter with dignity and purpose, rather than turning it into a media circus. Their goal was not revenge, but change. One evening, about a month after the incident, Imani was sitting in their New York apartment, looking out at the glittering city lights. Marcus came in and handed her a tablet. On the screen was an article from an aviation trade journal. The headline read, "EFA announces new guidance on passenger removals, citing need to combat implicit bias." The article detailed new, stricter protocols for captains, requiring them to make direct contact with all parties in a passenger dispute and to seek corroboration before taking drastic action, like returning to a gate. It specifically mentioned that attitudinal or behavioral complaints without concrete observable actions were not sufficient grounds for removal. Imani looked up at Marcus, her eyes shining. "They listened," she whispered. "You made them listen," he replied, taking her hand. "By refusing to be broken, by standing in your truth. You didn't just win a battle on a plane, Imani. You changed the whole damn rule book." The fight had been exhausting, the humiliation profound. But sitting there, seeing the tangible systemic change born from one horrific night, Imani felt a sense of peace. The cost had been high, but the result was a sky that was hopefully a little bit safer and a little more just for everyone who flew it. 6 months later, the dust had settled, but the landscape had been permanently altered. The story of Flight 214 became a quiet legend within global air, a cautionary tale whispered in training rooms and crew lounges, the Vance-Hayes Protocol. As the new anti-bias training was informally known, was now a mandatory part of every employee's annual recurrent training. The changes were not just on paper. Flight attendants were now trained to de-escalate, to investigate, to seek multiple perspectives, rather than defaulting to the passenger with the highest status. Captains were reminded that their ultimate responsibility was to the safety and rights of every soul on board, not just the ones who were most vocal or most familiar. For Imani and Marcus, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but with a new layer of purpose. They became reluctant, but powerful advocates for change. They established the Hayes-Vance grant through the Sisters of the Skies Foundation, using the settlement money to provide full scholarships for aspiring black female aviators and aviation engineers. Their story, shared in targeted forums, inspired countless others to speak out against the more subtle forms of discrimination they faced daily. One crisp autumn morning, Imani found herself back at an airport, this time for a vacation. It was the first time she and Marcus were flying together, purely for pleasure since the incident. They were headed to Italy for 2 weeks, a long overdue escape. As they walked through the terminal, a young black woman in a global air pilot's uniform stopped in front of them. She looked to be in her late 20s, her face bright with a mixture of nervousness and awe. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes on Marcus, then shifting to Imani. "You're Captain Vance and you're Dr. Hayes, aren't you?" Imani and Marcus exchanged a look and smiled. "We are," Marcus said warmly. "My name is First Officer Alicia Roberts." The young pilot said, her voice filled with emotion. I just wanted to thank you. I'm one of the first recipients of the Hayes-Vance grant. Your story, what you both did, it's why I'm here. It's why a lot of us are here. You didn't just make things right for yourselves. You paved the way for the rest of us." Imani felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at this bright, confident young woman, the living embodiment of the change they had fought for. This was the true resolution. It wasn't about the firings or the financial settlements. It was about this. It was about opening a door that had been slammed in her face and holding it open for others to walk through. "It's an honor to meet you, First Officer Roberts," Imani said, her voice genuine. "Keep flying high." As they settled into their first-class seats, incident-free this time, Imani looked out the window at the bustling tarmac. She saw planes from dozens of airlines, a complex dance of arrivals and departures. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel a sense of dread or anxiety. She felt hope. The wound from that night would likely always be a part of her, a faint scar to remind her of the ugliness she had faced. But it was no longer a source of pain. It had been transformed into a source of strength, a testament to her resilience, and a catalyst for a change that would ripple outwards long after she had landed. The sky was vast and wide, and she finally felt once again that there was a place for her within it. The story of Dr. Imani Hayes is a stark and powerful reminder that sometimes the most vicious battles aren't fought with fists, but with whispers, assumptions, and the abuse of authority. Her experience on Flight 214 shows how quickly prejudice can escalate when enabled by systems and individuals who choose the path of least resistance. But it's also a story of incredible strength, the power of speaking truth, and the beautiful, hard-hitting precision of karma. It proves that one person armed with dignity and the right support can challenge an entire corporate structure and create real, lasting change. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with others. These are not just isolated incidents. They are part of a larger conversation we need to have about implicit bias. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories of justice and karma. What would you have done in Dr. Hayes' situation? Let us know in the comments below.